Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day we are interviewing consequential leaders and innovators in the fight against the coronavirus. We're fighting two separate battles in a larger war over America's character as a nation. As we were still hunkering down to combat the coronavirus, America's unresolved history of racism and police brutality repeated itself and erupted. In the past 2 weeks, hundreds of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets all over the world, despite the threat of COVID-19, to protest the killing of George Floyd while in police custody. That act of violence, watched on a gruesome video, set off a firestorm of protesting, of riots, looting, and even more videotaped instances of police violence. A week ago today, President Trump used the Secret Service, the U.S. Park Police, DEA drug enforcement personnel, and the National Guard, and maybe more, to clear Lafayette Park just moments before engaging in a photo op in front of the church of many U.S. presidents, St. John's Episcopal Church, which had been damaged by looters the night before. It was a display of military might and rough-handedness towards peaceful protesters that a few applauded, while deeply upsetting and disturbing to most who witnessed what happened, even to some Republican supporters of the president. One official there on the scene was the 20th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. Recently, he jotted down something interesting in the margin of a speech he'd prepared to give the troops. He noted that we are all committed to the idea that is America, that is the oath to the American people. The best-selling book, The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World, examines America's commitment to broad concepts like justice, humility, faith, tolerance, liberty, and democracy. As we seem to be struggling now more than ever to define what this country's promise at home and around the world is, it is appropriate to speak with the book's author. Joining me now is the former dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, former director of policy planning at the State Department, a scholar, author, and CEO of New America, a think tank dedicated to renewing the promise of America. Welcome, Anne Marie Slaughter. Anne Marie, I read those notes by General Milley in the column, and I went immediately to take the book I had read over 10 years ago. It was published in 2007, off the shelf, and reread that book. And that book is so prescient to the battle going on today, in my mind. I'd just love to first start with your insights of how you're looking at the struggle over the values that define us as a nation.
So, Steve, it's great to be able to talk to you, and particularly at this moment. And I did see those notes in General Milley's memorandum, and indeed, in many ways, we are battling for the soul of America, for an idea of this country that, frankly, we have never achieved, right? They are our ideals, to begin with, of the equality of all people, which we are far from, democracy, liberty, justice, but fighting for that idea, even while recognizing that we fall short, is the best engine of progress that we have. And I got the title, The Idea That Is America, from a memorandum written by Captain Ian Fishbeck when he was writing to Senator John McCain to say, American troops are torturing Iraqis in Abu Ghraib. I have tried to stand up against this. I've written my commanders. I have not gotten a response. I am writing to you because we cannot sacrifice the idea that is America. We have to face our own flaws, our own hypocrisy in many cases, but we have to do that and with radical honesty, so that we can then try once again to hold ourselves to our highest ideals. And that's in large part what I think is going on right now.
You know, in my editor's note, Anne Marie, that I've already written for today's report, I said that even I have had to look internally, that I used to sort of take American values for granted, that they were sort of a done deal. And thus in foreign policy, I was more of a realist. I said, you know, you had to make hard choices about America's economic issues and core national security issues. I sort of thought the values thing was largely taken care of, and I recognized I was wrong. As we look at what's happening domestically in the United States, how do you think other countries in the world are looking at this moment?
Well, I think what's so interesting is that the actions of our government, of Trump, in so many things that he has done, essentially trying to tear up the multilateral order, being much more favorable to dictators than to democracies, that has lost us respect and power around the world in ways that are deeply worrying. But these protests are actually inspiring imitation or solidarity. In other words, people have been coming out in countries around the world both to protest the killing of George Floyd and violence and police abuse in the United States, but also in their own countries. So there's a moment here where ordinary Americans standing up for being better than we are is still inspiring to people around the world. But the country we have been in recent years has been essentially a rejection of those values in ways that are frightening to people, but they also lead countries around the world to decide that we are not to be trusted.
You know, we've seen Mitt Romney out walking with protesters in Black Lives Matter, and he says Black Lives Matter. You just referenced John McCain. You worked for Hillary Clinton in a Democratic administration, but you have lots of contacts and friends across the aisle in the Republican Party. How do you think that Republican Party can come back as a responsible stakeholder in some of these issues?
I do not think that the Republican Party, as it has evolved under Donald Trump, can continue over the longer term as the Republican Party that was created by Abraham Lincoln. I think we are at a moment of reshuffling, whether that looks like 1913 with the Bull Moose Party and the Republican Party. It's not clear, and I actually strongly favor a system of multi-party democracy, which we could have if we adopted ranked choice voting, so that where you have third parties, they act as spoilers. But I'm certain that we're at a moment of political evolution where the parties, particularly the Republican Party, but to some extent the Democratic Party as well, are reconfiguring, or the underlying political landscape is evolving. And again, part of this is demography. I was just listening over the weekend. That 90% of the American electorate was white in 1970, of voting Americans, in part because of voter suppression. That's now down to 70%, 65%. And as we go forward, we have to find a way to actually be in our power structure the country we are becoming. Right now, our power structure is overwhelmingly white and still pretty overwhelmingly male. We cannot have that power structure on top of a country that is genuinely reflecting the world more and more.
Now, I know that you yourself have been leading, but you have a big institution, New America, that's been looking at these social contract issues for a long time. It's been looking at gender equity, gender fairness. It's been looking at race. And I guess the question is, in a crisis like this, which is staggeringly large, what can be done to make sure the social contract that comes out on the other end actually really solves, doesn't paper over, but really begins to address? I was just reading a piece about the 20-year difference in life expectancy between different zip codes in the Baltimore area. How do we begin really moving that in a way that it is no longer just something we talk about?
Well, Steve, when you and I met, you were at New America, then the New America Foundation, and I was at Princeton, and we've evolved in various ways. But you're quite right that New America has long been focused on the big ideas, and the next social contract was work that it did back in the aughts. I do think this is a time for really big change. I would talk about building an entire infrastructure of care and connection in ways that creates a new social foundation. And New America works on a lot of those ideas. But in my own self-examination over these past weeks, and longer than that, but brought to a head now, I am quite convinced that we can't just look at the big ideas out there and think we're going to somehow fix things out there without taking a really hard look in here. That means as individuals. I mean, a question I've been asking myself is, do I have the courage next time I see an African American pulled over by the police to stop and either to film or simply bear witness? Is that something that I can now do, recognizing what I have seen? But similarly, inside organizations, New America has a number of people of color in leadership positions, not nearly enough. And if we look at the divide between the people who are in policy positions versus administrative positions, something I think we see certainly across Washington and the country, we have to make changes at the individual and personal level, not just the abstract advocacy, what we want to see happen out there level.
When you were at the State Department, you did what was called the QDDR. I won't lose our audience on this, but the Quadrennial Development and Defense Review. I was very, very taken with that because at the point, it was also sorting out what roles an institution like the State Department should play versus what roles the Department of Defense should play. And at that time, Defense Secretary Robert Gates was saying the State Department needed more resources, we needed more things to do. But it just reminded me that you have lots of contacts with generals, with folks in the Pentagon. And today, we've been struggling over the issue of whether, as going back to Mark Milley's comments, of whether the United States military should be or should have been deployed against American citizens around the nation. And I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think is going on in the Pentagon right now. And I got to tell you, just this is my own editorial side, the fact that we were all debating this on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square crackdown was a shocker for me.
Yes, there was a very, very dark moment last week, at least for me, when I saw General Milley in combat fatigues walking behind the president across Lafayette Park, which they had just cleared violently with flashbangs and tear gas and helicopters flying really low. And I really thought, this looks like dictatorships around the world, and as you point out, around the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. But I will say that by later in the week, on the anniversary of D-Day, these quotes from General Eisenhower about taking responsibility and upholding the Constitution, the extraordinary articles in the Atlantic from Admiral Mullen, who of course was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, also former Secretary of Defense and General James Mattis, enormously important, as well as General Milley's memorandum to the troops saying your loyalty is to the Constitution. It is to the country more than the commander-in-chief. He didn't spell it out quite so bluntly, but it was, in the end, you cannot break the Constitution even at the orders of the commander-in-chief. And that, to me, is fundamentally the heart of the best of our military. Our military is also far more diverse than many, many American institutions. And I truly don't believe that our military would turn on the American people. And we got close in a way that frightened many of us, but I think we've pulled back from the brink, although we've still got to keep fighting.
You know, just in our last minute, Anne-Marie, two of our mutual friends, Charlie Kupchan and John Eikenberry, recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that said, look, for it's not too late. America can basically come back, but it's got to stop kicking its allies in the teeth and stop hugging, you know, the world's worst autocrats. But they said there's still a window open. I'm more pessimistic. Maybe this is where my cynicism creeps back in. But the question is, when we think about the idea that it's America and what it has stood for people around the world, do you think there really is a way back? And can America snap back into a global leadership role? Or are we going to have to be negotiating with these currents now of doubt and lack of trust in the United States for a long time?
So, Steve, I actually don't think that we can snap back. I'm an optimist, and a sort of a globalist and a multilateralist, all those things. But I really think that we have to find a new way to be in the world. We can still lead, but we're going to have to lead in a very different way, not a 20th century, we are a superpower and we expect you to follow us, but much more in a whole of America, not just our federal government, but our mayors and our governors and our business leaders and our civic leaders, all of our resources focused on enormous global problems, from climate change to pandemics, to scarcity of water and food and energy, much more universal problems, rather than seeing ourselves as the most powerful nation among 200 other nations still engaged in great power competition and expecting other nations to follow our lead. We're going to have to figure that out. But again, we're a different country in this century. We are going to be a plurality country, no white majority, and we are going to face a different set of global problems. And so much of the foreign policy establishment is still looking firmly backwards.
Well, Anne-Marie Slaughter, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today. And I rarely do this, but to my public, I'm going to say, go back. This book may be 13 years old, but it is as relevant today as it was back then. The Idea That Is America, you can get it on Amazon. So Anne-Marie Slaughter, thank you so much for joining me. Thank all of you for joining me today. We'll see you tomorrow. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.